We'll get right to the overnight developments in what is now day 12 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. After violating two ceasefire attempts over the weekend, Russia says its military will hold its fire this morning and open humanitarian corridors to allow civilians to evacuate. The ceasefire was supposed to take effect this morning, but Ukraine's deputy prime minister rejected that offer as unacceptable and proposed her own route, saying Ukrainians will travel west and not to Belarus or Russia.
Well, and there's no reason at this point, Katty, that any Ukrainian should believe anything that Vladimir Putin says, obviously. But we've had a couple of ceasefires put in place. Civilians have started moving, and then Russians have aimed for the civilians and killed them. The front page of the New York Times, just a heartbreaking picture of an entire family slaughtered, cut down yesterday, a husband, his wife, son, girl, just slaughtered by Russians, not indiscriminately, actually targeting young children and family members.
Which is why you now have more members of the international community saying that there are possible war crimes being committed in Ukraine, and an investigative team from The Hague already starting to gather that evidence of whether Vladimir Putin is guilty of war crimes. That photograph, awful, of the family lying in the street, dead, killed by Russian bullets, is the kind of thing that we are seeing because we still have international journalists there and journalists there who are able to get them out. In Russia, they've got a total news blackout. They're not seeing these kinds of pictures. And we need Russians to be able to see what's happening there, because the amount of disinformation that's happening in Russia is a problem. Well, if Russians knew what was happening, perhaps there'd be a bit more pressure on Vladimir Putin not to be doing this.
And Mika, we're hearing one story after another of Russians who are living in Ukraine, trying to explain to family members, trying to explain to parents back home, trying to explain to friends back home what's going on.
Right.
And they're being told, no, that would never happen. Russia would never do that. The disinformation is so overwhelming there. The lies. It is a regime, and we've always known this. It was what was true with the Soviet Union is true with Vladimir Putin's Russia. It is a regime built entirely on lies that they keep telling their own people. And despite that fact, Mika, people are still getting out in the street protesting this war. Despite the fact they know they could be sent to jail for 15 years.
World leaders are considering their options. French President Emmanuel Macron again spoke to Vladimir Putin for nearly 2 hours yesterday and said he asked him to stop fighting, to protect civilians, and to send aid. Russian forces violated a temporary ceasefire in the port city of Mariupol yesterday, hampering evacuation with a barrage of shelling. Ukrainian officials say Russian shelling has hit critical infrastructure in the city, which is desperately short on food, water, and medicine. According to the Red Cross, around 200,000 people are trapped in the city. The situation in and around the capital of Kiev is no different. At least 8 civilians, including, as Joe mentioned, an entire family, was killed by Russian shelling yesterday. An advisor to President Zelensky described the situation there as catastrophic. Meanwhile, President Zelensky is warning that Moscow is trying to renew its push to take Odessa, another key port city on the southern coast that would largely shut off Ukraine from international shipping. This as a third round of talks between the two sides are scheduled to take place later today. According to the UN, more than 300 civilians have been killed since the invasion began, but acknowledged that the toll could be much higher. Moscow has consistently denied targeting civilians.
Well, just another clear lie. Katty, they're firing rounds into one apartment building after another, one civilian target after another. They're gunning down. We have journalists. We've seen journalists from Sky News who clearly identified themselves as journalists being shot up, their car being filled up with Russian bullets, them having to try to escape, even though a few of them got shot. This is clearly, I mean, I understand our government is going to have to be very tactful about this if they try to bring both sides together in peace at some point. But these are war crimes that are being committed. Clearly war crimes. Vladimir Putin is a war criminal. Sergei Lavrov is a war criminal. Everybody associated with this regime is a war criminal. They're doing the same thing here that they've done in past attacks. I mean, this looks far too much like what we've seen from Vladimir Putin and the Russian government going back to Grozny time and time again. They go in, they don't know how to fight a war. Conventionally, they stumble, look foolish, so then they start aiming at civilians and do what they did with Grozny, just level it to the ground.
Grozny 94, Aleppo
Right.
2015, and we see the consequences of it. Boris Johnson, so far, the primary Western leader to come out and say he's convinced there have been war crimes. Obviously, the White House doesn't want to say that. But with every atrocity that we see, an off-ramp for Vladimir Putin gets harder.
Right.
Because how does he row back from what he is now
Civilians
doing
and
in
nuclear power
Ukraine?
plants.
Yeah, civilians, nuclear power plants. Really quickly, we're about to go to Richard Engel, but before we do, the Labour Party correctly going after Boris Johnson, who talk about a very light touch on these Russian oligarchs. When is the pressure in Great Britain going to rise? So he's going to actually have to start being tough on Russian oligarchs.
I've been watching the British press every day now. There are stories. There was a big expose over the course of the weekend on Sunday about how Boris Johnson put pressure potentially on the intelligence services to be easy on one of the oligarchs who he was naming for a peerage back in the UK. The problem with the sanctions so far that the UK has put on is that there's a time lag. We're going to sanction you, Joe, but it's going to happen in 3 or 4 weeks.
We're going to give you months to move the money around.
In your few weeks, if you think that you'd like to go to the Cayman Islands, perhaps that's where you'd like to shovel your money, because in the UK there's going to be sanctions for you, but they're not happening now. And that is the pressure. That's the loophole. And are they going to give the investigative teams? Because a lot of this money is hidden in very complicated ways through shell companies,
Well, they could find it if the Prime Minister would let them go after it.
If the Prime Minister would give them the resources to have the investigators to find it.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.